Hello and welcome to the new lesson. Today we will be discussing on discourse of marginalization with reference to disability. We will be talking about gender, poverty and other such indicators. I am Professor Archana Dasi, Department of Social Work, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. So, let us understand what marginalization is all about. Marginalization connotes a vision of being sidelined from participating in an activity, or in other words being able to participate but at the margins. This point of exclusion is evident in the estimations that 98% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school. Within the Middle East and North Africa region, educational systems exclude more than 95% of the disabled school age population at the primary level. Therefore, it is important to stress that conceiving of the experiences of people with disabilities as marginalized underestimates their experiences. Now, let us see the intersectionality framework and disability. Now, what is this intersectionality all about? Intersectionality is a theoretical framework that posits that multiple social categories, that is race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, intersect at the micro level of individual experience to reflect multiple interlocking systems of privilege and oppression at macro level, social structure level, that is racism, sexism, heterosexism. These intersectional forces impact the disabled person's overall development and exposure to life experiences. Now, for instance, gender is the key determinant that determines health and development related outcomes in lives of persons with disability. In gendered societies, gender, socioeconomic status and disability create multiple layers of discrimination. Working together, gender and disability create an extreme form of marginalization. The intersection of gender and disability create multiple layers of discrimination for women. Disability often adds to and worsens the discrimination against women and negatively impacts their gender roles, furthering their perceived weakness and helplessness. Impoverished women who have disabilities make up some of the most isolated and overlooked people in the world. Often they are excluded from women's movements due to their disability, disability movements due to their gender, and one-third world contexts due to their poverty. Intersectional forces impact the ways in which impoverished women with disabilities experience violence, making them 2 to 4 times as prone to violence as their able-bodied counterparts. In low resource settings, women with disabilities encounter many forms of violence, including caretaker abuse, forced sterilization and sexual violence. In South Africa, the lack of services and state-sponsored support for impoverished women with disabilities worsens their situation. In an effort to address this deficit, attention should be focused on providing and creating specialized organizations and programs to support women with disabilities who experience violence. Further, there is a circular relation between poverty, disability and education. World Bank studies indicate that 500 million people are indisputably amongst the poorest of the poor and are estimated to comprise 15 to 20% of the poorest in the developing countries. This is the data for the disabled. In addition to significant financial costs associated with impairments, disabled people are frequently dragged further and further into poverty as a result of exclusion from mainstream social, economic and political opportunities throughout their lives. Additionally, the experience of poverty makes it difficult to meet the basic needs, which unmet can lead to disability. If intersection of gender is added, it even makes situation critical. Poverty for women can mean violence and abuse within marriage and the family, heightened hunger due to norms of women eating last, and other gendered forms of suffering. The prioritization of men and boys when resources are scarce presents numerous problems for women and girls. Poor health becomes a result of lack of food and medical care, being overworked and experiencing too many pregnancies without space in between. These conditions increase the likelihood of becoming disabled or giving birth to a child with a disability. Therefore, in a volatile situation like poverty, disability becomes the tipping point that prevents a household from being able to recover. Causes of high rates of disability and marginalization are poverty, malnutrition, violence and blood marriage. Blood marriage is consanguinity. Causes of high rates of disability have been identified due to poverty, malnutrition, violence and consanguineous marriages. For example, hearing loss is the most frequently occurring birth defect. For instance, in Jordan, the incidence of significant permanent hearing loss is 6 to 7 times higher than in United States. It is estimated that by 2004, there would be a minimum of 73,000 very young Jordanians with a serious hearing problem. Major causes of hearing loss are reported as consanguinity, that is blood marriage, and poor health related to poverty. Another contributing factor for increased numbers of children with disabilities is significant growth measured by fertility rates in the population as a whole. Violence in countries experiencing conflict contributes to the incidence of disability in several ways. First, it directly contributes to disability because many of the casualties are women and children. United Nations enable reports that for every child killed in warfare, 3 are injured and acquire a permanent form of disability. Second, it affects children's well-being through social disruption and exacerbated conditions of poverty. And third, it reduces access to basic health services and resources for preventive health care. Fourth, malnutrition increases adversely affecting children's cognitive development. Further, key indicators will explain the root causes of marginalization among people with disability. So, indicators of marginalization for people with disabilities, here we are talking about indicators of exclusion for people with disabilities as well as their associated problems, taking note of their interactions and cumulative effect. So, the first is poverty and disability. So, we are trying to link up poverty with disability here. Marginalization is generally conceived as an economic problem quantitatively related to indexes of poverty. It is widely recognized that poverty and lack of education go hand in hand and lock disabled people into chronic cycle. Specifically, exclusion from education translates into limited social contacts, poor health and low self-esteem. As a result, income generating opportunities become further reduced, leading to chronic poverty, further exclusion and higher risks of illness, injury and impairment. The second linkage is education and disability. When disabled people are denied educational opportunities, then it is lack of education and not their disabilities that limit them. The third is minority status and disability. Marginalization due to minority status often emerges in heterogeneous stratified societies that encompass a variety of ethnic groups, languages and customs or other factors such as disability. However, the minority status alone does not inevitably lead to marginalization. It is diversity accompanied by derogation and discrimination that leads to exclusion. The main driver is the existence of subgroups within countries accompanied by social stratification and cultural norms. Heterogeneity within the country may not only reflect a composition of traditional groups, but also voluntary migration and involuntary resettlement. Among minority population, rates of disability tend to be higher than the general population due to higher rates of poverty, malnutrition, violence and lack of access to basic services. The next indicator is cultural norms and disability. Cultural links to disability constitute a critical influence on marginalization. Culturally embedded attitudes render the severity of an impairment inconsequential compared to the social consequences of disablement. In a traditional Muslim household, a girl child with a slight disfigurement may be fully functional but considered unfit for marriage, making education unnecessary in the eyes of her parents. By contrast, a boy with a more severe impairment within the same household might be sent to school and given support that greatly diminish the influence of the impairment. One of the authors by the name of Bukhari in 1997, he has done a study in Lebanon and he has talked about the Lebanese cultural context. The birth of a disabled child is seen by many as not only a misfortune but as shameful and embarrassing. So is the case in Indian context also. The husband's family is likely to blame the misfortune on the mother and is likely to consign her or his mother to a lifetime of misery. Essentially, cross-cultural differences in the interpretation of disability show that the lives of people with disability are made more difficult not so much by their specific impairment as by the way society interprets and reacts to disability. Another indicator is gender and disability. Well, by Levi's and Lockheed in 2006, they have reported that worldwide 70% of the 60 million girls not in primary school come from excluded groups, including those with disabilities. Children and youth with disabilities experience marginalization differently according to gender. That is, physical, social and psychological factors have a strong gender dimension. In patriarchal societies, decision of whether or not to send a child to school are typically made by father. When resources within families are scarce, decisions favor the boys over the girls, including children with disabilities. Gendered analysis of disability has been particularly valuable in demonstrating the web of social and biological factors that disable people, not just women. Gendered analysis addresses the processes through which both femininity and masculinity are constituted and the implications of these processes for people with impairments, thereby moving beyond the particular focus of feminism on the experiences of women. The gendered experience of disability. Let us look into the gendered experience. Disabled people have often been represented as without gender, as asexual creatures, as freaks of nature, monstrous, the other of the social norm. In this way, it may be assumed that for disabled people, gender has little bearing. Yet, the image of disability may be intensified by gender. For women, a sense of intensified passivity and helplessness. For men, a corrupted masculinity generated by enforced dependence. Moreover, these images have real consequences in terms of education, employment, living arrangements and personal relationships, victimization and abuse that then in turn reinforce the images in the public sphere. The gendered experience of disability reveals sustained patterns of difference between men and women. For people with disabilities, gendering is conditional. Age of onset of disability combined with the type of impairment leads to gender expectations. Gendered studies of disability in Western industrial nations reveal the following patterns of public and private dimensions. So, let us see how the disabled is looked in the public arena. More women than men are classified as disabled, particularly as aging populations mean that larger proportions of the elderly are women with impairments. While disabled people are much more likely to live in poverty, women are likely to be poorer than men, especially in developing countries where women are often heads of the households. Younger disabled women achieve lower educational outcomes than men. Disabled women are less likely to be in the paid workforce than either men with disabilities for non-disabled women, and in general have lower incomes from employment. Women are less likely to have access to rehabilitation and to employment outcomes when they do receive rehabilitation. The age distribution for women is different to men, older versus younger. The type of impairments are different for women and men, with women more likely to experience degenerative conditions, while men are more likely to experience injury-related events. Women are more likely to experience public spaces as intimidating and dangerous. Now, what happens in the private and the familial arena? Disabled women are more likely to be living on their own or in their parental family than men. Disabled women are more likely to be divorced and less likely to marry than men with disabilities. Women are more likely to face medical interventions to control their fertility. Women are more likely to experience sexual violence in relationships and in institutions. Women experience more extreme social categorization than men, being more likely to be seen either as hypersexual and uncontrollable or desexualized and inert. Moreover, in the developing world, gender patterns in relation to disability indicate that poverty hits harder on women and girls due to patriarchal property ownership structures. Aid is less likely to reach women and girls who are less able to compete in situations of scarcity. Disabled women are more vulnerable to domestic violence. Disabled girls are likely to find their access to education even more limited than girls in general. Women disabled by war have few resources to survive. Disabled women who are sexually abused are likely to have few, if any, social supports or options. Disabled women are less likely to be accepted as refugees by industrially advanced countries. For example, Australia prohibits the immigration of people with disabilities. Disability has been used as a powerful metaphor in psychology, particularly as a means to assign to women the status of incomplete or deformed men. In addition, gender stereotypes have been used to characterize disabled people, particularly men who have been presented as feminized and lacking masculine traits. These approaches have confused the conceptual difference between disability and gender. Gendered analysis of disability have tried to move beyond these metaphors to create a disciplined account of the impact on the gendered psyche of disabling social relations. Here, four elements are presented: the development of the normal individual, the impact of disabling events, support for the survival of the disabled psyche, and strategies for normalizing and social role valorization. There is ample evidence that women with disabilities experience major psychosocial problems that remain largely neglected, including depression, stress, lowered self-esteem, and social isolation. Evidence also suggests that women tend to be directed towards home-based activities, while men are likely to be supported into more public and outward-looking opportunities. Thus, cultures sustain the social relationship of gender disability in constant reiterations of stereotypes and expectations. Put simply, disabled men are expected to behave and express their being differently to disabled women in all cultures, though the manner of their expressions will be culturally specific. It is likely though that the hierarchies of power, most usually male over female, able-bodied over disabled, will set the cultural parameters. Let's see what happens in the social realm. Sociological account of gender and disability stresses the systematic nature of the social order and its reinforcement of powerful social institutions and their capacity to enact and impose definitions and allocate resources. For disability, the most central institutions remain those associated with the medical profession, rehabilitation and social support. Many other institutions also reproduce patterns of gendered discrimination such as education, employment and transport. One of the most potent patterns of discrimination is in the access to and use of public space. Both gender and disability have both traditionally been seen as a product of biology. Gender, as a result of biology, has been thought to determine all manner of social behaviors on the part of men and women. In a similar way, disability as biology has been seen as determining disabled people's choices and behaviors. In 1970s, feminists attempted to differentiate gender from sex, the social from the biological, to counter the argument of women being naturally inferior and weak. So too disability theorists attempted to separate disability from impairment, again the social from the biological. Lorber in year 2000 has shown that while social action around disability issues has benefited both women and men, women with disabilities are less likely to be economically self-supporting or to have spouses to care for them. These patterns, together with conventional norms of femininity, have hindered the quest for independence for women with disabilities. Women thus confront major obstacles not only in relation to overcoming disabling environments, but also in achieving equal outcomes as men similarly disabled. Poverty is considered as a cause and a consequence of disability. Let's see how. Poverty is both a cause and consequence of disability. Poverty and disability reinforce each other, contributing to increased vulnerability and exclusion. The majority of people with disabilities find their situation affects their chances of going to school, working for a living, enjoying family life and participating as equals in social life. It is estimated that only 2% of the people with disabilities in developing countries have access to rehabilitation and appropriate basic services. Poor nutrition, dangerous working and living conditions, limited access to vaccination programs and to health and maternity care, poor hygiene, bad sanitation, inadequate information about the causes of impairment, war and conflict and natural disasters all cause disability. Many of these causes are preventable. According to World Health Organization, as many as 20 million women a year suffer disability and long-term complications as a result of pregnancy and childbirth. The most common causes of motor disability are injuries from accidents on the road, at home or the workplace, war and violence including landmines, birth trauma and the infectious diseases such as polio and leprosy. Children are often disabled as a result of malnutrition. In turn, disability exacerbates poverty by increasing isolation and economic strain, not just for the individual but often for the affected family as well. Children with disabilities are more likely to die young or be neglected, malnourished and poor. People with disabilities who are denied education are then unable to find employment, driving them more deeply into poverty. Breaking out of the vicious cycle of poverty and disability becomes more and more difficult. The result of the cycle of poverty and disability is that people with disabilities are usually amongst the poorest of the poor and their literacy rates are considerably lower than the rest of the population. Women with disabilities suffer a double discrimination. both on grounds of gender and of impairment. Their literacy rates are lower than their male counterparts. Recent UNESCO studies have suggested that only 1 to 2% of children with disabilities in developing countries receive education. Boys with disabilities attend school more frequently than girls with disabilities. Studies show that women with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be victims of physical and sexual abuse than women with no disabilities. Their access to reproductive health care is minimal, and as a result they suffer greater vulnerability to reproductive health problems. There is a lack of awareness regarding women with disabilities and reproductive health needs. More often than not, it is assumed that they do not form part of the target groups because being disabled is associated with being sexless. As many as 50% of the disabilities are preventable and directly linked to poverty. Now, let us see what is the cost of this disability for the country. Disability does not just affect the individual, but it impacts the whole community. The cost of excluding people with disabilities from taking an active part in community life is high and has to be borne by the society, particularly those who take on the burden of care. This exclusion often leads to losses in productivity and human potential. The United Nations estimates that 25% of the entire population is adversely affected in one way or the other as a result of disabilities. The cost of disability has 3 components: the direct cost of treatment, including the cost of travel and access; the indirect cost to those who are not directly affected, we are talking about the caregivers; the opportunity cost of income foregone from incapacity. Now, talking about rights and social exclusion in reference to disability. There is an important and fundamental difference between disability and other forms of disadvantage. People with disabilities can only organize themselves to claim their rights when their additional practical needs such as mobility aids have been met. People with disabilities have a right to be included in all aspects of life. In order to fight for the right of inclusion, people with disabilities need to live in an environment in which they are empowered. People with disabilities face numerous barriers in realizing equal opportunities: environmental and access barriers, legal and institutional barriers, and attitudinal barriers which cause social exclusion. Social exclusion is often the hardest barrier to overcome and is usually associated with feelings of shame, fear, and rejection. Negative stereotypes are commonly attached to disability. So, people with disabilities are often assigned a low social status and in some cases are considered worthless. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on discourse of marginalization. That will be all for today. Thank you and goodbye.